Today's episode of the Teacher Think Aloud podcast is sponsored by Ellie, and that's spelled E-L-L-I-I.
Ellie is one of the world's largest and leading content platforms for English teachers. The site is trusted and used in more than 10,000 schools around the world.
And what's really special about Ellie is that through all of their growth and popularity over their 20 years in business, they've intentionally remained a small independent company with a great love of producing highly engaging, ready-made lessons, videos, and resources to help you teach a better class.
Their content library is packed full of discussion starters, dialogues, role plays, grammar exercises, story prompts, picture prompts, and the list goes on. And even though the quantity is massive, it's the quality of each lesson and resource that makes Ellie so popular among so many English teachers.
Their lessons are timely, interesting, thought-provoking, and most importantly, designed to get your English students talking and actively participating in every class you teach.
Great teachers need great content. So if you're not already subscribed to Ellie, do yourself a favor and head over to ellie.com right now. That's ELLII.com.
Hello and welcome to the Teacher Think Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shé and Anna.
And I'm Anna Chiriani Dean. Happy 2025!
Yay! This is our first episode of 2025, so it's fine for us to say that still, right? 3 weeks into January.
Yeah, better late than never. Thanks for being here with us, listeners.
Today, we're going to look at the importance of integrating soft skills and ICC in ESP.
That's a mouthful. Intercultural communicative competence in English for specific purposes context. I think I got it. Okay.
You did, and soft skills.
Oh, and by soft skills, Shé, what exactly are we talking about?
The term soft skills has gotten a lot of attention over the last few years. Essentially, we're talking about the skills that aren't technical, aren't hard skills, so to speak, but the other skills that we need to navigate and collaborate in the globalized workplace. So generally speaking, meeting etiquette, independence, flexibility, leadership skills, and so on.
Right. And which soft skills you integrate into instruction depends largely on the ESP context you're working in. On today's episode, we're chatting with an educator who prepares multilingual healthcare professionals to work in novel medical contexts and with diverse clientele.
Let's meet Shweta.
Thank you very much, Anna and Shé, for having me on your podcast. It's a real privilege and honor. So my name is Shweta. I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. My pronouns are she and her. And in one sentence, I help English as a second language healthcare professionals communicate better.
Naturally, we were very impressed with Shweta's concision in introducing herself. We'll learn a bit more about how she came to exist in this role in a minute after our customary icebreaker.
Given that this is the very beginning of 2025, I can't believe it, and this is going to be our first episode of the year, our question to you is, what is one goal you have for 2025?
Definitely, I think it would be to get my my first paid client. Yeah, I think, that would be amazing.
She had that on the tip of her tongue, didn't she?
She sure did. Shweta has been working with healthcare professionals in an informal way for a while, but she's been working to formalize her offerings.
Let's hear how she got into this line of work and what inspired it.
Tell us a little bit about your background and what inspired you to focus on English for specific purposes for healthcare professionals.
Okay, so I have grown up with a healthcare professional in my house in the form of a parent. So my mom is a doctor. And usually the path that children of doctors take is that they also go into the same profession. For me personally, I knew from a very young age two things that I learned from my mom. And I had that clarity of thinking from a very young age to not do two things. Don't pursue medicine and don't have children. So until date, I have stuck to the two of them. So whilst I was always good at science and health, I did not want to practice it in the space of medicine. However, I liked talking about it and I liked to implement the knowledge that I had in this area. So That's why I eventually, once I got older and everything like that, during my university, I started tutoring students on science and biology subjects, eventually became a teacher in those areas. And then for me to be able to have a much greater variety in sort of work that I was doing in teaching, I got my TEFL certification, which gave me the license to obviously teach English as a second language. And I did that both online and in person for close to about 6 years. And so collectively, I have a teaching experience of almost 15 years. And so this one actually integrates, both what I experienced seeing my mum work as a healthcare professional, because she used to have patients come over, and as well as, as someone who has traveled a lot and has experienced, being friends with and work with people of different cultures. I felt that this is a good blend of both, what I'm professionally experienced in and I have an interest in. But I also felt that now the scope and space of healthcare is really changed in the last 10, 15 years in terms of the diversity that you see in both healthcare professionals and patients, culturally, linguistically, and everything else.
I love that Shweta found her happy place. She thought through what experience she has, both indirect and direct exposure to medicine through her mom's profession and through her tutoring of students in the topics integral to medicine, science, and health.
Yeah, and we can't forget the all-important ingredient here, right? She enjoyed engaging with people from different cultures, paid attention to communication norms, and that informed her decision as well.
I also really appreciate how reflective she was from such a young age, noticing that she could learn from her mother's experience and was astute enough to declare, I don't want to be a doctor. I always say the best example is the anti-example, right?
And I think there's also a takeaway for individuals who are listening and thinking how they might carve out a little niche for themselves in the world of ESP. Don't stop reflecting on what you're good at, what skill sets you already possess. Think also of how these skills and experiences might converge with what you're interested in. That's really important if you're trying to create a sustainable path for yourself.
One final thing that Shweta considered was the environment she was living in. She observed that the healthcare landscape has seen some changes in the last decade or so, particularly in terms of the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of patients. Of course, that's true in our globalized world, but how does that show up in reality?
Let's dig a bit deeper into her rationale.
Gone are the days where patients would just do what the doctor tells you to, or the healthcare professional tells you to. They are much more informed and aware of their rights, and they have many more expectations of how they want healthcare professionals to work with them. And I think one of the areas where I think that it is a struggle for healthcare professionals is a lot of patients really don't trust them. And it's because they've had bad experiences in the past with other healthcare professionals. Aspects of medicine can be quite controversial, and it doesn't really, of what mainstream society tells us about it. There was a real need for change. So I think instead of trying to change the biases and everything that patients have, I thought, let's just train the healthcare professionals to become more competent and more aware and more attuned with the skills that they need in this day and age. I mean, because one thing is that, you have your accolades, you have your knowledge base, you have everything. But when you're dealing with patients, they are human beings, and they're not just human beings. They are human beings with needs, health needs. They are much more vulnerable. So they need many more core skills, which a lot of their studies really don't teach them. It is covered from time to time, but it's not really covered in as much detail as it should. And mind you, when I say healthcare professionals, I'm not just talking about doctors. I'm talking about every single area of healthcare you can think of. So be it nurses, speech pathologists, physiotherapists, you name it. So I think equipping them with those skills and those competencies for them to really stand out in their profession and in their workplace as a person of excellence, someone who also builds authority and influence, and someone that people becomes the go-to person, someone who is recommended by patients to their friends and family, basically.
Yeah. Well, you're really empowering them in that way. So I really like that. And I also just love your backstory because, you found a different pathway than just becoming a healthcare professional yourself to merge that with your intercultural communication passion as well. I think that the skills that you're talking about this need for that interpersonal skill set, especially, across cultures. It's a skill that's important not just for speakers of languages other than English, but also just for healthcare professionals more generally. But I know that you specifically focus on working with healthcare professionals whose first language is not English. So is there anything specific about their needs that you kind of came to realize over time?
Well, they don't think that they need it as much, but I can really see that's where the need is something that they could really benefit from. Common thing that they tell me is that, I'm very good at English, so I don't think I need to learn about communication. So it's about dispelling that myth that just because you're good at a language, it doesn't mean that you can communicate well in that language. So, and I think for healthcare professionals from that background, it is a little bit of a double whammy, because not only are they dealing with obviously becoming more fluent, now some say they are. The other thing is that because communication is a much more nuanced concept, which entails a lot of other elements. So it's not just knowing what to say, but also how to say it, how to respond to if a patient is telling you or asking you something, and do it in a way that sort of initiates a further response from the patient, whether that be positive or negative, or whether that might be another question. What you don't want to be doing is having those awkward moments of, oh, I don't know what to say here. I mean, I think I know what to say. Say for example, you have, a patient comes in and asks about chemotherapy treatment. Now you can read off a textbook and just say what it's going to involve. But when it comes to things like the patient might be very anxious about the side effects of chemotherapy. Now instead of just reading off a list that these are the XYZ, these are the list of side effects that you can experience, what a healthcare professional will have to do is approach this in a much more empathetic manner and validate the patient's concerns, and sort of reassure them that this is what they can expect, and there is support available. Now this is just one example that I'm using. So these really subtle skills that are what we call popularly, they are called soft skills. That's what I feel is really missing, and it is even more challenging for healthcare professionals who are from that background, because they feel that I've done all my exams and I've done my IELTS and OET and everything, so I know it all. But when it comes to facing patients who are quite different to not only how you are, but also when you see a range of patients, I think this is a skill that is not really addressed and fine-tuned as much as it should.
And there's a lot of nuance.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and I'm just thinking about the importance of healthcare professionals having, we say bedside manners, right? But those are nuanced, from one country or one culture to another, those manners might look different, right? So I imagine that there's just a lot of fertile land to explore with these different individuals. Tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that these multilingual healthcare professionals are facing as they're coming into a new workplace culture in maybe a different country than their country of origin.
Now, there's a lot of them that come to Australia. I can tell you that my own GP is of a Chinese background. Over the years, I've had to change GPs many, many, many times. And more often than not, you are going to get a healthcare professional in a country like Australia, which is so multicultural anyway. It will be a person of color or a person from a non-white background. One of the main challenges that they have is that they think that the way that they approach patients and carry out their professional duties back in their country of origin you do it in the same exact manner. So I think as this applies in any area, as you're sort of working, or if you're in the workforce, you are sort of conditioned to follow everything by the book. So follow it step by step, stick to protocols and procedures. And look, don't get me wrong, that can be a very good way to give structure to something. But I think when it comes to dealing with humans and patients, you have to be a lot more adaptable and fluid. So that's what they really face. So they feel that, what they may be used to back in their country. So just say, for example, if you are a healthcare professional, like whether you're in a country like India, Sri Lanka, or I don't know, Thailand, the Philippines, whatever, in those places, healthcare professionals are sort of put on a pedestal. So they are given a lot of importance and respect. Reputation really improves when you say that you work in healthcare. Whereas in a country like Australia, it's really not like that. I mean, I'm not saying that they're not valued here, but what I'm saying is that the way that patients sort of view you and treat you is very different. It's sort of like becomes like you are providing them a service, in that way. So that's what they expect from you. So, and this is something that they really, really struggle to get their head around when they first move here. And again, the same thing that, back in their countries, because they are in a position of authority as a healthcare professional, they feel that they can just get the patient to do as they're told. Realistically, it doesn't work like that. Dr. Rangan Chatterjee, he's a very influential and very, very popular GP from the UK. And in a recent podcast interview of his that I was listening to, he said that, gone are the days where you can expect patients to just do as they're told. So he regularly has, interactions with his patients, and he tells them, for example, everyone knows it's not a good idea to smoke. So he'll tell them that you need to quit smoking. They're not going to do it. But eventually how he gets them to understand the benefit and the value of it. Yeah, so that's another challenge that people, healthcare professionals have. So how they can really build that trust and influence and authority with their patients. And especially when you are not only in a non-homogeneous environment, so your patients could be of different ethnicities, and therefore the cultural makeup would be very, very different. It's not just that. Neurodivergence is a very big thing that back in the day, you just never addressed it. So how you speak and how you communicate with neurodivergent patients. Say, for example, if you have patients who are from an LGBTQ background, and whereas as a healthcare professional, you probably come from a country where that's probably illegal and frowned upon. How would you work with them? So the more diverse and mixed I think the patient cohort is getting, I think there is a real need for healthcare professionals, no matter what they're doing, to be able to communicate in a way that really sort of aligns and best suits that and addresses the needs of those diverse patients and give them an experience that is impactful and positive. So that is a huge challenge that I see in the area.
That's super interesting. I think as teachers, we're always thinking about how we can better serve diverse populations, but it's not something that I had thought like, doctors need to have that, their minds wrapped around that piece as well. I think you covered some really important points. And thinking about this idea of respect and reverence for, doctors in their home countries versus in a more multicultural place like the UK or like Australia or the US, I feel like teachers can connect to that idea as well. I know I've worked with teachers from different countries who have said, I don't understand, Shé, like back home, we're respected. People care about the work we do. Why are teachers so abused in the United States? What's up with that? Yeah. So I think there's a connection there for our audience.
Yeah, that customer service aspect there. So I guess my question from there is thinking about strategies. These are very broad topics, complex topics. And so how is it that you get to help your clients understand these workplace dynamics? Do you have any examples you might share with us?
One of the very first things that I get clients to understand is, becoming more self-aware, because I think a lot of people go into healthcare because of the reputation that it sort of gives them, but they really don't understand their underlying motives behind why it is that they need to do this. What is it that they need, and what is it that really motivates them to show up to work every day and work with their patients? So that's really what I get them to first understand. Looking at different scenarios, the nuances in different cultures, how you become more culturally aware, sensitive, and competent. And also in that, I also include these aspects like neurodivergence and other forms of diversity that you are more than likely to find now.
I want to pause here and applaud Shweta for including the cultivation of self-awareness for the healthcare professionals she works with. From an ICC perspective, we encourage students to start with the self, right? The idea being that to understand how other cultures operate, you first need to acknowledge the lens from which you're observing your environment.
Right. So from the perspective of a healthcare professional, it's impossible, as Shweta shared with us, to understand every nuance of every culture you may or may not interact with. But what you can do is attempt to understand what the cultural and societal influences are on the individuals you serve from different cultures.
So she mentioned earlier that a doctor needs to be able to talk to a client about chemotherapy, the processes, the side effects, possible outcomes. And no matter which culture you're operating in, this is going to be a difficult conversation. But But if you have knowledge of communication patterns, for example, an individual from the US is likely going to be comfortable with a more direct communication of information. Maybe even ask the doctor to give it to them straight, since the US is an example of a low context communication culture, one that uses explicit and verbal communication to avoid misunderstandings.
Right. While communicating with someone from a high context culture, that is a culture that places more emphasis on nonverbal cues, individuals from those cultures might expect more robust delivery of news, perhaps with more lead-in, use of warmer body language, among other things. It's not about whether the information is delivered, but how.
Now, mind you, this is not a steadfast rule, and we don't want to create overgeneralizations about a single culture or make the assumption that an individual from a low or high context culture unequivocally prefers that type of communication, right? We always need to consider the individual. But doing this research up front about a culture can help create a safer space and language for recipients of care.
Another soft skill that I think deserves attention here is the ability to explain diagnoses or procedures in layman's terms. Not everyone went to med school, so I think it's really important for healthcare providers to ensure they're using language that isn't too jargon heavy.
Something else that comes up for me here is the importance of conflict resolution. You can't predict how individuals will respond, particularly when they might be receiving tough information, right? When someone maybe becomes defensive or combative even, providers need to be able to show compassion and remain firm and do so without escalating a situation. I don't envy them.
Yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot to consider in this field, for sure. Let's learn more about the strategies Shweta employs to support the multilingual care providers she works with, which includes both synchronous and asynchronous methods.
I sort of give them more practical, hands-on exercises that they can do in, once they've finished the module. And obviously, there is support available where they can message me or send me like a voice note or something like that if they have questions. I get them to record themselves, not exactly what they are doing when they're speaking to a patient, but it's just, for them to sort of reflect on what it is that they can, how they can sort of improve on it. Yeah, so those are just some things. And obviously with one-on-one support and help with me, where clients go through different scenarios of, culturally where they may have had a bit of, misunderstanding, they may have had a little bit of an awkwardness, and in that case, what they could have done. So it's a lot of reflective work goes into it as well. What was done, what they could have done better, and what they would incorporate and apply in the future. So whilst, yes, I am the one who's supporting them, I make the experience as reflective as possible with them, just for them to be held more accountable and be more responsible for what they're doing.
Well, I love that combination of reflection and case studies, scenarios, whether they're personal or maybe you present them with some made-up scenarios.
Now, Anna, you and I don't have experience working with healthcare professionals in an ESP environment, do we?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, just making sure. You never know. There's so much that we don't share with each other until it comes up on the podcast.
Right.
So, what Shweta has shared as far as strategy goes, having individuals reflect on interactions they have, reflect on the care they provide. This seems like an effective way to ensure that healthcare professionals she's working with get the soft skills that they need to best serve their clients.
Yeah, in this way, engaging them with topics that are specific to their environment, the conversations they're having with patients, they're not only practicing using that very specific language, but they're practicing skills like hedging and claim softening that are key in delivery, right?
Yeah, and I can see role-playing also being extremely useful here. Beyond examining a case study and talking about how the communication could be improved, creating dialogue related to those case studies, take it up a notch. Shweta could listen in not just to what they're saying, but how they're saying something to patients. Active listening is also a critical skill here. And a language and culture coach for healthcare professionals might model how their body language can demonstrate that active and empathetic listening is taking place.
Yeah, and in general, this mirroring of real-world scenarios is incredibly important in any ESP context. Whether you're working with restaurant workers, lawyers, or IT specialists, you really want to ensure your client is using the language and the behavior needed in their respective context.
And I must come back to that reflective component again. We put reflection on a pedestal on this podcast, of course. And we know it has a place in all types of education. But I want to highlight that it is an especially useful tool in working with professionals of any type, as they're often what we might call time poor and are looking for the most effective and efficient path to targeted improvement.
You're right. Without identifying areas for improvement in advance, individuals might not feel like the program is customized to their needs or that their time isn't being respected.
We don't want that. I'm with you. Reverse engineering is the way to go. And even better if you sit down with the individual before you get started, understand what they feel they need, where they want to end up, and create the program from there.
Yes, needs assessment is always the first stop.
That's right. Listeners, we want to hear from you. What has been your experience teaching soft skills in an ESP environment? Which skills do you think should be examined no matter the field or industry? What techniques do you find work best?
You can write to us on social media or get in touch via email at teacherthinkaloud@gmail.com. We welcome your questions, reflections, and ideas.
And if you haven't already, please take a moment to like this episode, share it with a colleague, and subscribe to our platforms. We appreciate the support.
And as always, you can find Shweta's contact information and some related resources in the show notes.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. Until next time, happy teaching.
And happy reflecting.